Good morning, evening, and day to you all. My name is Andrew Woodfield, and I am joined by our guest, Stephen Gates. He is the founder of Crazy Design Studio. He is also the host of the Crazy One podcast that's been on the airwaves for over 7 years now. He has over 20 years of experience in strategy and design at senior leadership roles for companies like Envision, Citibank, Starwood Hotels. And he has won over, is that 150 major awards that I see here?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, who keeps count at this point? Yeah, I think it was something like that.
Basically, he
A
knows what he's
bunch.
doing in the industry. He's got a great mind on his shoulders. Stephen, welcome to the podcast. It's really
Awesome.
interesting
Thanks
because
so much for
we've
having me.
talked how many times now, and it's gone a nice rhythm. But as soon as we hit record on these things, it gets interesting.
Well, that's always because all of a sudden you're it's being recorded. So then all of a sudden it's there's the pressure around all that.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And it's the second one out. So we'll see how many people actually backtrack into the archives to hear this one, but I'm sure it's going to be a good one. I wanted to open it up with our most recent re-engagement because we spoke back in January about a handful of ideas that I had. And it was this grandiose vision of what I wanted to work toward with a product studio and a startup studio, which you, having mentored probably thousands of people at this point, meet a ton of people with ideas. But it wasn't until, I want to say like 8 to 10 months after that I actually reached back out to you when I was going through my own realm of taking action on things.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got the ball rolling, I took action. But a question that I had for you is like, how often is it that you talk to people and they're really excited about an idea that they have, but you don't really hear from them again, or things shift or change?
Oh, I mean, generally all the time. I mean, it's always fascinating because I think like I'll go out and I'll do talks and you definitely have people who will come up to you after a talk and they're really fired up and they're going to go do all this stuff and they're super excited about things and they're going to take action and they're going to make all this change. And then you go back to the same event and you talk again next year and you can sort of watch them like trying to sneak out of the back of the room and you find them somewhere later and they were trying to sneak out of the back of the room because they didn't want to get questions around, have they made those changes or done those things? So, I mean, look, it varies. I think, sometimes it is people come back in a matter of weeks. Sometimes it's 8 to 10 months. But look, I think that's always the hard part, right? Is that as an idea goes from the spark of inspiration to the reality of execution, there can be a lot of twists and turns along that journey that people don't necessarily expect.
Yeah, 100%. And when it comes to the twists and turns and that people don't necessarily expect, what are some of the characteristics that you notice in people that stick with it? Characteristics in them, or maybe their alignment with their expectations of people
Yeah.
that do follow through versus don't.
I think a lot. I mean, because look, I think like the number one piece of advice. So I do. I mentor people every single week. I coach people, and the number one piece of advice that I give out the most is success is a choice. And because I think it's just like any other change in your life, right? I think for a lot of people, it's about like, oh, I'm gonna have one big moment, or do one big thing, or I'm gonna, and then it'll all be different.
Mm.
That's not the way it is, right? And look, I think that there is something around, the people that are the most successful are the ones that are willing to put in the work. They're the ones that are willing to think it through. They're the ones that are willing to pivot, to be uncomfortable, to take a risk, look, I even think in my own career, I mean, look, I'm not the most talented creative. I'm not the best designer, but I think a lot of what has made my career into what it is just my willingness to jump and kind of figure it out on the way down, right? So I think, but that's what it is I think a lot of those people who are either willing to jump or aren't just really willing to listen to either their inner critics or external advice sometimes, that maybe they're not doing what everybody else does, right? And I think, again, that's the podcast that I've had for 7.5 years has been based on that premise, is that for me, the things that make us different, that's our superpower, right? That's that different perspective, that different take. That's incredibly powerful. But I think a lot of the industry and a lot of things like that wants you to believe that if you aren't doing it, quote unquote, like everybody else, then somehow you're doing it wrong. And I've always rejected that. But I think, that's the thing, is the people who are willing to put in the work, put in the time, figure things out. Because I mean, that's my thing, right? Like, look, I'll hire passion over talent
Hmm.
every day of the week, because I think talent wins in the short term, but that passion, hustle, grind, that's going to win in the end. Because at some point, like, a lot of people who are high talent don't tend to always have high work ethic,
Sure.
and that often in the end, like, like I said, talent will win the race early on, but as you look over the arc of somebody's career,
Hmm.
there's sort of a limit to how far that can take you. And I think the people that are willing to put in the work, they almost always will beat them in the end.
Love that. And thinking about that, and when it comes to hiring on for passion over talent, there's got to be a blend of both, right? So
Mhm.
what's the mix that you look for, and maybe even because I know that you and I have spoken for the audience for a little bit of context. Stephen and I share this perceived flaw in the enterprise industry or the career industry of being very multifaceted when it comes to our perspectives, our expertise, our experience. So while you might be hiring for passion, you are looking for some skill set, and whether it's for a role at a company or a startup looking for a co-founder,
Sure.
what are some of the keys that you look for in alignment with the passion?
Yeah, and because look, it's got to be both. But here, the insight that I always go back to was, whenever I was going into art school, I ended up actually having one of the professors I had was the professor who did my portfolio review. And I was really fascinated because I said, look, you've got to, whenever you have kids coming into an art school or a program like that, how do you tell the difference between a kid that maybe went to like a fine arts high school in New York City for the last 4 years versus some kid from Iowa who went to public school and no arts program, right? Like,
Hmm.
how the fit and finish and level of those portfolios is going to be wildly different. So
Yeah.
how do you decide? And I think his answer was one that has sort of stuck with me in answer to this question is he said, look, what I'm really looking for is I can't teach thinking. I can't teach creativity. I can't teach hustle. I can teach you how to hold a pencil. Right. And so I think that's a lot of it for me, where I've hired people who have been in other industries, or I can teach you how to use Figma or Photoshop, or
Mm,
again, I can teach you the tools of that.
yeah.
But I think that's a lot of what it is that I'm looking for. And I think, in many cases, the two interview questions that I always ask that always screw people up. Um, the one is, can you tell me how you have an idea? There's not a
Mm,
right answer to this question, right? But what I'm simply looking for is, do you have an awareness of your creative process? Is it happenstance, or do you have are you doing the work to understand how can you summon your creativity on demand? Now,
interesting.
obviously, the higher the position, the higher fidelity I'm looking for in that answer. But the other part of it is, can you tell me what you need to be happy? Because I think,
Mm,
again, there needs to be a certain level of emotional intelligence, because creativity is often so bound to emotion. And I've had people who've come back 2 and 3 days later saying, I haven't slept because I don't know the answer to those questions. And I think they are a little bit non-traditional, but I think that's a lot of what it is for me, is that, what is the thinking? What is your willingness to just accept a problem at face value? A lot of those sort of things. And I think even to me, whenever there are times whenever I will get into I know often controversial practice of even giving somebody a design exercise, we'll
mm.
time box it to 45 minutes, but my exercise is because I don't want to steal anybody's work. Can you redesign like the homepage of our app using only emojis? Because I'm looking for creativity, systems thinking, nonlinear thinking. I want to give you a problem where you don't have a reference point,
Mm,
right? Like, there's a lot of those sort of skills that I'm trying to test out. And again, we're never going to go launch an app with emojis, but I think this is a lot of the thing for me that I'm definitely looking for, because I know I can teach you how to present. I can teach you how to use, again, a lot of that blocking and tackling,
mhm.
and the more commoditized parts of the profession, those can be easily learned.
Interesting. I love that. There's a few things I want to dig into in with you on there, but one of them in particular is you made a mention of not taking the problem at face value. Can you tell me a little bit more about the problem with that in the different spaces that you've
Sure.
been in? Yeah.
Yeah, and look, and I think of all the teams I've gone in and worked with hundreds of teams, and I think, like, one of the biggest problems that you'll often see whenever you sit down and you say, okay, look, why aren't we doing better work? Whenever you say, okay, look, why aren't we being more creative? is the number of times that creatives and teams are given a solution to be vetted, not a problem to be solved. Right? Because I
Yeah.
think that oftentimes my role as a head of design or senior creative or whatever it is to teach an organization how to get comfortable being uncomfortable. How do we explore possibilities? How do we, because I think, this is often, as somebody who's actually launched real industry changing innovation, the challenge with a lot of that work is that you often don't know where you're going to end up when you start.
Hmm.
And so that there has to be a willingness to experiment, to try things that don't work, to be able to go through and discover what that is, to be able to take risks, right? Like there's a lot of, this is often why the creative process and corporate culture sit in like rather violent opposition to each other.
Hmm.
Because what they reward is often very, very different sort of things. And so I think that oftentimes, that's a lot of your role when you're working with a client is how do you just keep them in the state of possibility, the state of being uncomfortable, the state of not going with the first thing that everybody thinks of, because that's going to be their natural tendency. So, but there's a real skill to being able to do that.
And how do you create safe spaces, especially when you're talking about where you end up is probably not where you're starting, or maybe even halfway through, you might experience or identify a pretty significant pivot. What are some things that you've noticed contribute to creating the safe space so that leadership or stakeholders or individuals that just aren't familiar with the creative process can feel comfortable making those kind of changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think look, it starts by normalizing what does creativity actually mean? How do we go through it? The fact that it isn't just a bunch of us off like wearing berets doing watercolors of our spirit animals, right? Like there's an actual process we can prototype, we can gather data, we can do, again, a lot of the times this is why I'll turn to design thinking or design sprints, because it puts the customers at the center of what we do. It's iterative. It allows me to be able to bring all of my stakeholders into the process, yet it will strip titles and politics out of ideas and reduce it down to like just simply whatever works.
Yep.
It takes advantage of the psychological principle that people will support what they're a part of. They rarely support what is presented to them. And so again, I think that way, whenever they're involved in that process, they can see the rapid development, they can see the iteration, the testing, the customers. You're realigning that source of truth, because most creativity is killed inside of companies because everybody spends more energy fighting over who's right than what's right for the customer.
Love that.
Right? Like that's the number one killer of is design right, is product right, is an executive, like your customer doesn't give a shit who's right? Like that doesn't matter. If that's your source of truth, your product and again, your profits and everything are going to suffer for it. So again, I think if you're able to realign that, what does the customer want? How do we do to, and be able to sort of push and find insights in that, that allows you to be able to make sort of significant change. But I do think a lot of it is setting up that this isn't going to be, whenever we brief it in, that we know what the answer is, that this is the problem, this is the approach we're going to take, this is the timing we're going to use, this is how we're going to be able to get there, this is where the check-ins are, this is when we're going to set deadlines, to be able to do those sort of things. Because again, we are a part of a business. This isn't art. We are accountable to results, to financial outcomes and things like that.
Yep.
But again, I think that a lot of getting in there and demonstrating that, but it more than anything, it is aligning that my value and the value of my team is in our thinking and our creativity. That is where the real value and real differentiator, that's where the real innovation is going to come from. Too many teams, like over 90% of the teams that I go in to talk to that are having problems, have reduced their value down to just the visual execution of design. Which means they have developed a commoditized relationship to their organization, who sees them just as the make it pretty people that kills all of our souls. And I think that a lot of it is in that realignment to more of a strategic asset, more of a thinker, more of a, a Sherpa of the way we can do things. Because I know everybody's creative, just most everybody forgot, so that then I can help guide them through that process.
I love that. There was something that you spoke to, I think gets tangled up with this as well, in one of your recent talks, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier when you're talking about the pencil idea, right, and the tools of the trade. So there's this space to cultivate creativity, to get everybody on board and get them engaged in the process. But I'd love you to dip into maybe and tell us a story about what you refer to as the technology trap. So in these instances, especially now with all the noise in the world, we're usually approached with a solution to be vetted versus a problem
Yeah.
to be solved, as you've stated before. Um, in this paradigm where there's so much news and noise, I should say, of this innovation and technology, and being put in the center of a space where you're cultivating this creativity, and somebody might just want to be implementing technology for the sake of technology. How do you pull on that thread? And can you tell me a story on when you've gone through that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the bottom line for me is I just think technology is not an idea, right? Technology is a pencil. I think technology is often a tool to be able to tell a story, to be able to express something. And I think, especially in the digital space and others, we get very, very caught up in. And again, if you just look at the number of brands recently who needed to have their own NFT or have their own cryptocurrency or have their own, again, like you name it for whatever it is, um, which yielded no movement in their business, no brand differentiation. All that it really served was probably to be a bullet point on a slide for their board of directors, so
Mm-hmm.
that everybody felt like they're being innovative and to be able to check a box, right? There's no
Yeah.
actual genuine innovation, differentiation, anything that gets created out of that. Because I think it's a very kind of like me too approach to innovation. Everybody else has an NFT, we need to have one too. So I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
it for me is that, look, just think for yourself. And I think a lot of people will talk about things theoretically. And I'm very much a believer of, I want to be able to go in to use it, to design for it, to evaluate it, to understand what it is, to see how it could apply to our business. Even in sometimes if that's in non-traditional ways. I think the one of the stories I tell all the time was a lot of people always want to ask, because I was one of the first designers that was asked as like one of the first outsiders to work on Apple Watch by Apple, like months before it was announced publicly. We were one of the first two big launch apps. We did the app where you could open your hotel door with your watch. How did that come about, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what that was isn't in the way that people would actually think, because the funny part was that started with the dumpster fire that was Google Glass. Because I had a reasonable belief that wearables were going to get to a form factor that would actually provide value.
Mm.
Glass was the first form factor that came onto the market that you could actually use or do anything with,
Yep.
right? I think anybody who had any sort of awareness could tell that walking around with a camera in the middle of your face and a display that only you could see was not going to be a miracle of social engineering and was going to be a massive, massive problem. But the reason why we went in, and so we went in and designed an app for it, and we launched an app for it, and everybody's like, why the hell are you designing for this? This doesn't make any sense. And we kept agreeing with them that this was not going to be the right form factor, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
But we could see the value in what that was. So the reason why we designed the app was because we wanted tangible experience to what was it like designing on wearables? What is it like to be able to get to a 5 to 7 second interaction period down from the 30-second to 2-minute that we saw on a mobile form factor?
Mm.
Well, the whole reason why we did that was because then I reached out to my contacts at Apple and said, hey, there's rumors around you guys might be launching a watch. If you do, we have thoughts. And
Mm.
because we've been working on this, here are what those thoughts are. Not surprisingly, then we got the call and everything else ensued, right? But I think a lot of what it was to actually go in and look at it. And I think a lot of times my proudest moments haven't been that we've been the first to use a technology.
Mm-hmm.
It's been that we've been the first to stop using a technology.
Hmm.
And I think there's lots of times, whether it's Second Life or other platforms, where like you go in, you learn what you want to learn, you be able to do things like that, you figure out what it is. If it has value, you keep doing it. If not, you learn what you want to learn and you get the hell out. Because it's just, again, I think so much of our time and innovation is spent on this Me Too work that your customers get tired of it. You start to become noise. They start to tune you out, right? Like if it doesn't provide value to them,
Mm-hmm.
and again, if it's a self-serving, because I want to be right, self-serving internal audience,
Mm.
it's not innovation, right? And I think a lot of brands take a whole lot of comfort that they are really innovative, to the point where, I had an engagement not too long ago with a fairly large brand who brought me in to have an innovation conversation,
Mm-hmm.
look at all their processes. At the end of the day, you could tell they'd read a few too many books, because they said, what do you think our superpower is? And I said, you don't want me to answer that. And they said, no. Like, what do you think our superpower is? Like, how innovative are we? And I'm like, you're not going to hire me again if I answer this. Honestly, they're like, no, tell us. I said, your superpower is your ability to rationalize mediocrity. Right. And that's why I don't get hired again. But that's the problem, right? Is that they kept doing these like Me Too innovations. They kept,
Mm,
again, there was no, they weren't moving the needle. They weren't getting any brand separation. There was no results in what it was. It was a very self serving internal audience into the way they were doing innovation. But they wanted me to tell me that, they were the next whiz kid or whatever it was. And it's just
yeah.
like, this isn't what that looks like.
Yeah. And for engagements like that, or for people that might have that biased perspective that they're unaware of, um, do you think that there's a way to guide them to a space to recognize that and kind of elevate that level of self awareness to move
Oh,
into a
yeah.
space of innovation?
And look, I think a lot of it for me, again, goes back to what is the source of truth for your work? Right? If the source of truth for your work is who you are designing for, if you are putting it
Mm,
in front of them, again, like one of my sources of truth is my mom. Honestly,
cool.
she is not a technology savvy person. If that is something that I can give her and she can see the value and the benefit and what it is and understand how to use it, there's probably value there, right? I
Yes.
think, but if you're doing things like that where you aren't creating your own echo chamber, I think if you are taking the
Yeah.
time to understand that this is, because for me, I've always treated technology like a pencil, right? At the end of the day, it is about the mark that you make, the message that
Mm,
you put down, the image you create, right? Like if you're not creating something that resonates, that solves a basic human need, that moves the needle, that pushes people to action or pushes your business,
yep.
right? Like you have to be solving a problem. And just doing it because everybody else did it is solving an internal problem, not a customer problem. So if you're
Love
able to
that.
use that source of truth and your customers are saying, because there are many a product roadmap I have destroyed because all I did was just go and ask the customers, do you find value in this? It's such a simple thing, but it's amazing to me now how many creatives and how many executives don't they want to be right, they want to be the customer, right? And then they want to sit around and not understand and hire a bunch of consultants to tell them why they're launching things that nobody wants.
That's interesting as well, because you just framed it that they want to go externally to hire consultants to advise on these things as opposed to using their internal resources
Mhm.
as well. Where's the disconnect there?
Well, because I think, and that's been a long-standing, for me, a long-standing whatever it is, frustration being a part of in-house teams. It's
Mm,
definitely a part of the way that I built my studio, because I think that there remains this perception that external thinking is better, right? Because I think
interesting.
that, you're going to come in with fresh eyes. You're going to come in with a fresh perspective. You're going to come in with a bigger perspective. You're going
Mm,
to, and I think that's a lot of times why and I think, that was something that I've had to fight in my career and other things like that is that, look, our team is living with your problem and your business 24/7 because there are
mm,
pros and cons to both sides, right? Like I'm not, there are benefits to both, right?
yep.
Because it is. I do think that agencies and consultancies and things like that can come in with fresh perspective and sometimes bigger thinking because they aren't aware of the history or legacy of what has gone before, so they aren't
Yeah.
constrained by that.
Yep.
The con there is though that they often develop things that aren't aware of how the business actually operates, so that they tend to look very good, but either can't be implemented or don't
Interesting.
genuinely solve the business need to the depth that they need to.
Mm,
The inverse is then the benefit of the in-house team is that they do live with the problems. They know where the bodies are buried. They know how the business runs and to be able to do that. But oftentimes their thinking is constrained and narrowed by those in-house constraints
mm,
so that
hmm.
they often are innovating as far as the project in front of them, not often to a bigger scale of thinking, right? So I think like cuz for me my balance was always I wanted to run teams that had kind of like an agency spirit with an in-house soul,
Mm,
right? I want them to be entrepreneurial. I want them to push. I want them to have bigger thinking, but I want that to be grounded in what is keeping the business up at night.
absolutely love that. And I know we've danced around this a little bit. But what can go into cultivating something like that?
So I mean, look, it's a really good question, and I think back whenever I was with Envision, we did the Design Frontier report, and we went out and studied 2,200 different companies,
Mm,
and you see about 80% of the companies in the world struggle with this problem.
hmm,
And I think a lot of what it comes down to is we as creatives, I think at the end of the day, often just simply take whatever we're handed and make the best of it. As you know, a lot of our partners in the business, a lot of our partners in engineering, a lot of executives have very either clear acceptance criteria or very clear standards for how they like to work, right? Because that's often the problem. Like
Mm.
product picks the deadline and engineering says how much time they need and we get whatever's left, right? Like, and I think that, that's often where you will watch the emergence of the maturity of creatives and of creative teams are the moments whenever they define what they need to be
Mm.
successful, right? Whenever they simply move out of more of the commoditized execution space and move up the funnel into the strategic space. And so again, I think that that's a lot of what it is that it's around valuing our thinking. It's around not just being commoditized and being boiled down to just simply execution. That there's a lot of those sort of things of defining what we need to be successful. Because in a lot of cases, I think
Mm.
what we fall victim to is that we will go through extraordinary lengths and take an absolute dumpster fire of a brief and put, incredible work out there. Know that we just performed a miracle. But to everybody else, it just looks like day-to-day work. Right. And I think we often tend to shy away from talking about what goes into that. We shy away from establishing our standards, from publicizing our successes.
Mm.
So again, I think that there's a lot of those behaviors where it is speaking a little bit more of the language of the business and
Yep.
acting a little bit more in that way, that often goes a really long way to be able to help us not just get the seat at the leadership table,
Mhm.
but to be able to get an equal share of the leadership.
Awesome. Absolutely awesome. There was something I was interested in your perspective around as well. Kind of on the same note, but in another paradigm. So instead of on an enterprise level and in corporations where there is this baggage and at the same time the recognition of value of strategy, but the disconnect in where to elicit that from, there is something that I'm noticing in the world of startups where innovation is at the forefront and it's what they want to lead the company, but it almost feels like sometimes it's been 50-50 that I've noticed the recognition of the importance of like strategic creative thinking in the conception phase as well.
Sure.
And putting the value in that strategy up front. Do you have any experience or could you speak to how that might be the same or different?
Yeah, I think I think you see sort of the same outcomes, but for different reasons, right? Because I think sometimes there's a lot of startups that I'll advise where they're like, we're agile. I'm like, no, you're just a mess, but politically savvy enough to try to call it agile, right? Like, I think that there does still need to be, no matter if it's a 1-person team or a 100-person team,
Mm-hmm.
there still needs to be a level of like rigor and how do we do divergent thinking and convergent thinking? How are we prototyping? How are we putting stuff into the market? How are we, and again, I think that that's often the problem with a lot of startups is because so much is so possible, which ultimately is often what I find kills more startups than anything
Blank
is
page syndrome.
the either the dilution of the vision or just simply lack of focus.
Mm.
That again, as somebody that has been a part of one of the unicorn startups and things like that, right? Like often it is either what is the value proposition or what is the one thing we want to do? How do you drive that to scale
Mm-hmm.
and to breakthrough and then start to look at possibilities? And I think that
Mm.
oftentimes everybody gets that like Jack Skellington, like, ooh, what's this? What's this? What's this? Right? And they start bouncing around and you don't have the runway, time, resources, or patience from your backers to be able to do some of those sort of things.
Yeah.
And so again, I think that a lot of times there's a perception that going to consumers or doing the prototyping or doing those sort of things will make you go slower or it's going to take longer or like we just need to ship, which you do, but shipping the wrong thing quickly isn't faster. Right. So I think we need to look at what is the prioritization, right? If the prioritization is just shipping anything,
Mm-hmm.
I would argue your priorities might be in the wrong place because even if you, again, didn't ship quite as often, but shipped much higher quality or things that are much higher impact, right?
Yep.
Those, again, if you look at the companies and the startups and early stage and whatever it is that are the most successful, those are the ones because your customers are going on a journey with you as well. And here again, I think a lot of people forget that even if there is an initial interest in a product and I come in and I start using it or I start experimenting with it or I start to sign up for it,
Mm-hmm.
I am watching to see over subsequent releases, are you behaving in a way where this is something I want to continue to invest in? Do I feel like updates are worth it? If all of a sudden you have breaking bugs that you're shipping every 4th version, your customer base isn't going to stick around.
Yeah.
Right. And because again, I think, that's what they're watching is, again, is this something where it feels like you are making good decisions? And I think that's the biggest thing, whether it's startups or company of any size, is the work is the truth of the culture that creates it. Right. If your culture is a mess, your product tends to be a mess. If your culture is highly siloed, your product, I can tell you if your org chart matches your website navigation, I can tell how siloed and screwed up your company is before we ever speak the first word, right?
Yeah.
So I think that there's that recognition, like the product is the truth of the culture that creates it, and that there's a direct line between those two. And so, again, I think that's a lot of what is tied to it. Are the companies that understand that are the ones that will scale consistently and be successful consistently.
Love that. Absolutely love that. And when you've advised startups in the past, do you notice that this is like on the top of the list in like patterns that you're seeing out there? Do you notice other gaps or other red flags or potholes that maybe have a higher common likelihood, if that makes sense?
Yeah, the biggest startup killers to me, and there's a few. I think one is what I talked about, which is just we have three visions, or the vision's going to change every 3 months, or we're going to keep. Because again, I think that there's a difference between a pivot and just having to admit that you maybe didn't have a real clear problem here to solve, and that you need to kind of reload and to be able to think about some of those sort of things. I think that sort of lack of clarity, whatever it is, that kills a ton of different startups that I see. I definitely see a lot get killed by, and I think this is a little bit more of a recent occurrence, a lot get killed by just, who are you building this for? Right? Because so many people, whenever I go in and I talk to them, they're building a product because they want to get to an exit. Right? Like, we are building something because we want to be bought. And then they don't understand why they don't get bought. Because the startups that I see that do scale and are bought more often than not, at least in my experience, are the ones that have a vision, that have a purpose, that are driving towards it. If that happens, great. But if not, they'll continue to go on their own because they are building something that they believe in. Founders who are building something that they hope somebody else believes in, you got to question how good your product's going to be if that's what your target is, right? Is if your target's like, hey, do you like us now? Do you like us now? What about now? Especially as you see capital markets change and things like that. I think that's a real problem. And then again, I think the lack of what it is just the lack of rigor or understanding of, like, look, just because it's a startup doesn't mean some of the basic processes, either around discipline or process or the way you approach creativity or things like that, don't apply. Just because you don't have the scale or structure or some of those sort of things. So again, I think that often is, those are the most common derailers. Whenever I get a founder who comes to me and says, look, I've only got 3 months of runway left. This is what we do. How do we save it? These are the most common themes.
When it comes to who you're building for and what about now? What about now? Do you like it now? There's been a handful of times where I've been brought into a conversation very much after the fact when there's only a little bit of runway left. And it's like, we have this product and we need to figure out how to find the problem to solve with it.
Right.
Outside of just complete reevaluation and starting from the beginning to validate where they got to identify where the pivot is, what strategies could be executed if there's a startup with a product and they lack the vision or they lack the problem in being able to make that match?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of times the process that I try to take them to is, I think whenever you've gotten there, I mean, it may sound weird, how you've gotten there is a little irrelevant to me. Like, we can go back and do the postmortem and do whatever that is, sure, but we are where we are, right? Like, the cards are in front of us. So let's evaluate that. And I think a lot of it for me is that just the simple exercise of, right, what is the why? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And then looking at, is that a differentiated problem? right? Is that something five other people have already solved? Are we going into a crowded space? Are we going into more of like a blue sky space? Do you have real differentiators? Do you understand how you're going to get to profit? Do you understand, right? Because there's a lot of those sort of things that it isn't just the runway. Like, do you need to raise another round? Because like if I need to be profitable in 6 months and my idea needs 18 months, we've got a much harder discussion, right? So I think that's a lot of it for me, is just the realities of where are we, right? Like, is this a right-sized idea? Do we need to scale it back? Like, whenever we go to, our MVP or GA, what does that need to look like? How is that right-sized for where the business is? And just try to introduce some of those constraints and guardrails. And really, for me, it's trying to boil down to like, look, if you don't have that 1, 2, 3 value propositions or moments where you think you can win, you can't move until you see that stuff, right? You can't move until, because I think, there's a lot of that, like, hey, we made a cool thing because we could. Can somebody tell us what it does? Like, like whenever you do this as a case study, when you're trying to get your next job, maybe they will. But I think that's a lot of what it is just like, look, let's start with that. Let's figure out what the way forward is. Then let's get into looking at what is the dysfunction around, process, market fit, like some of just the other, the how do we execute moving forward sort of thing. And look, and I think that there are some times whenever it just says, look, sometimes it's just not, it's too far gone.
Yeah. And those are tough conversations to be had. Yeah. But I think it's better to have that bitterness up front than a few months later on when it could turn into like a toxicity almost.
Well, I just think, I mean, for me, it's just, and there's a lot of, because look, I'm always a believer you kind of need a plan A, a plan B, plan C, whether you're looking for a job, whether you're doing a startup, whether you're doing whatever it is. I think that kind of like all or nothing mentality is very admirable and very anthemic and very movie-like, but I'm not always sure people think through the nothing part of that. Because, look, it's just, I've seen founders get divorced. I've seen them lose their family. I've seen them lose their homes. I've seen them overextend and to be able to do too much, right? Like this, yes, I understand the product and what that is, but there are real world consequences to what that is. And I think that's part of the discussion that I want to have is, if this does not work in 3 months, what is going to happen, right? Like if you just need to go back to your investors and you get more money, that's one conversation. If you're going to lose your family and your house because you've literally bet everything. And so again, I think sometimes, sometimes these things get maybe a little over intellectualized in terms of what the stakes can be.
How is it just a matter of having the conversation and just being real? Because, right, it's harder to have the conversation with yourself when you're in that space and you're keeping blinders on, I would assume. Is it just the dependency of having to have someone else come in to create the space for that conversation? Because I can only imagine that the people around them and in their life have tried the same. And I've been through life situations as well where the people close to me are, we're having really important conversations and I just don't need to hear it. But until it's like I come to that acknowledgement myself, or almost have somebody from the outside that doesn't have the same kind of connection or relationship with me, that affords me the space to reflect a little bit more honestly.
I mean, look, I definitely think there's a conversation around, is somebody listening or can they hear, sort of a thing. I think it's a little bit bigger than that. That I think that there is a serious mental health crisis that is going on, I think, across leadership inside of corporations. I think, leadership in founders. I think, and again, I have continued to argue for years now that I think that there is far more rampant imposter syndrome and mental health problems inside of leaders than there are probably in any other part of our industry. Because I think in a lot of cases, whatever I'm in that leadership position, whether I'm a founder, whether I'm a leader inside of a company, whatever that is, I have either a boss who wants results. I have, investors who want results. There is something to that. I have a team or a company that is looking to me for leadership, that oftentimes my support system is nowhere near where it needs to be, because either now I have the big job or all of my time is going into building my company. So I'm not taking the time to have a community, to be able to have a support system, to be able to get that sort of context for how am I doing, that I think leads to some of those conversations. In many cases, we're being asked to do things that are not our core skill set, right? Like for me, that's the cruel irony of like being a designer is the longer you're in this industry, the further you get away from what you love, right? Like I went to art school to work in Excel and to do budgets and hiring plans and succession. Like I got to not do all that, but you end up doing it. And so I think that there's a lot of this sort of, and all of these things really lead up to, again, now I'm in this sort of leadership position where I feel like I should have all the answers. I don't, because of all these sort of reasons. So I think that's a lot of it is, and look, and I think this is only being compounded by social media, because everybody is, tall and handsome, and their teams are all well funded, and their startups are all wildly, because right, like hard, nobody goes on LinkedIn and was like, wow, I fucked up today, right? And so I think, and because ultimately what happens in so many places is that the crisis is being born out of the fact that we're comparing our insides to everybody else's outsides, right? And it's a comparison you will never win. It will continue to propagate a real mental health crisis. And I think in the face of that, it is so incredibly hard just to kind of stand up and go, look, I don't think I'm doing well. I'm not sure that I'm okay. I'm not sure. Like, I know my business is not going well. I don't know what the alternative is. Because we have sort of created this like almost success porn sort of culture, right? Of like everything has to be work harder, like sacrifice everything, do everything. And then whenever the or else happens, it just, even the amount of people, I don't even think LinkedIn even understands. It's to the point where just even something as simple for somebody to put the open to work green ring on LinkedIn is like a scarlet letter for people, right? Like it's an admission of failure that I got laid off. And I don't think we understand the mental journey for something like, I'm just looking for a new job, scaling all the way up to being a founder, of the kind of position that we're in, that there is not a place for a healthier discussion of kind of what goes into these processes.
Yeah, and that's great. How might we, have you put any thought into how we might create that space? I can only imagine there are communities popping up around because of this growing gap.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's part of the reason why I think you're seeing a bit of the shift away from the bigger conferences down to smaller leadership camps. I think it's why you're seeing a lot of like Slack communities pop up. I started 3 or 4 years ago where once a month, I just reached out to like 50 of the people who I admire the most, right? Like 50 of my friends, coworkers, people that I really like, and just said, hey, once a month for an hour, anybody who wants to show up and talk about what's going on, we're all just going to get together and sort of talk about what's working, what's not working. It's a safe space, right? That. Like through the curation of what this is going to be, and look, and we can get together and talk about how people are doing really well. We can get together and say, hey, I'm up against this problem. Has anybody else experienced that? That there are conversations. Look, my business is not working and I'm not sure what to do. But it gives people a safe space. I think it gives them a place to be able to, where they know they can ask for help. I created sort of a chat group, Slack group to go along with that, so that in between those sort of meetings. So like for me, it was like, I recognize that I need to create that. And obviously there's a lot of resonance with other people. But I think it is actively understanding that caring for your health, creativity, and mental happiness or mental health, because look, your creativity is an instrument, right? Just like anything else. And I think we'll hear singers and other people talk about taking care of it. We tend to just abuse the living hell out of it. Like most of the ways where it's just like, I'm going to do this until I break, and then I'll, go take try and figure out some way to recharge, or just kind of white knuckle it through. And so I think, a lot of it for me is like, how do you find that community? How do you find those sort of things? It was a huge part of why I helped kind of found the Amazing Design People List, to be able to really work on mentoring and give people access to mentoring, to be able to do that, because that's such a broken system. And so again, I think you're seeing the emergence of more platforms, like ADP List or others, to try to kind of fill that gap. But again, I think a lot of it, and that's always my thing for people, is just try that once, talk to somebody to be able to find that conversation. Because I think once you're able to do it the first time, it's incredibly cathartic and helpful.
I love that. And one thing that came to my mind is, as a problem solver, always looking for problems, always looking for gaps, and how we can fill it with a solution, user focused, human focused, right at the center of it all. But But it almost seems like there's this, because my brain initially went to, oh, there's a gap in the marketplace. Maybe we could validate this and turn it into a product so it could actually scale and create a space for multiple people to come in. And then if that was the case, we'd obviously need to be able to support that monetarily. And like that thread
Hmm.
instantly starts tying into it. So it's almost like this needs to happen on both levels, on that personal level, so you can create those safe
Right.
spaces in your own communities and amongst the people. But how might you scale something like that so it could be self-sustaining without like the impeding, creeping monetization bug finding its way into the
Well,
room?
right. But part of what that is though also is I think, a lot of people need to sit down and have a realistic conversation around, are you doing it because you want to do it, or are you doing it because everybody else wants you to do it? Right. I get, like, for me in starting my own studio, I am vocally anti-scale, right? Which is,
Mm,
I think, which gets a lot of sort of like crooked head tilts from a lot of people, because like for me, it's like, look, I only want 2 or 3 clients. I want to work on the work. I don't want to create a 100-person agency. I don't want to scale. I don't want to sell it. I don't want to, right? And I think so many people are like, well, how's it going to get bigger? And it's like, why does it need to get bigger? And I think that, again, that's an external perception where it's like, look, I only want 2 or 3 clients. I want clients who I can really partner with, who respect me, where I want to value my creativity and mental health and happiness, where I want to focus on really good work, right? Like and again, where I've done this long enough where it's just like, look, there's a certain point where I need to recognize either my happiness or what is enough, and not let that be a value that is assigned by external factors. And that's why I said, like, to
mm,
me, it's just so fascinating where people are like, well, but it can be bigger. I'm like, it could be, but I don't want what comes with that. Right. Like, I would rather be smaller and run at a higher rate. Right. I'd rather be smaller and do better work. I'd rather be smaller and value partnership. Right. Like, I'd rather do a lot of those sort of things as opposed to, and again, I think that, for a lot of us, there is this pressure from this almost like invisible script of how we're supposed to build our career, or how do you build your company, or how do you, right? Like, there's a right way of doing it, but like you said before, nobody would tell you my career path was a good idea, right? And that is probably true for every single senior person, successful person you talk to, right? Like, nobody
yeah.
would look back and be like, that's a good idea. Right. And so again, I think, but again, there's this perception that there's a right way to do it. And that so many of us, so many of the people that I coach and so many of the people that I see that are in either a mental health crisis or a career crisis or things like that, it's because there is such a huge gap between who they are and who they think people want them to be. And that they show up as the ideal employee or the ideal, boss, or the ideal, which is exhausting, I think, after a while, especially if that drifts away from your values, your happiness, where you're subjugated from those sort of things. And I think that's why, you're seeing such a big pushback now against, either coming back to the office or wanting hybrid work or wanting
Mm,
remote, or because I think, that was the difference is, like, during the pandemic, a lot of people are like, wait, maybe this concept that I have to live in a big city to be successful, maybe that's not true anymore.
mm.
Maybe the idea that I have to kill myself, or a company that would get rid of me at the drop of a hat if it meant improving their bottom line, right? Maybe I need to think and understand that. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, are learning that the hard way more recently, because either you learn that lesson or you work long enough to find it out, right? So I think that ability to be able to say that, look, again, in the same way that it happens for creative teams, I think it happens for individuals, right? What are the things that I value? What are the things that I want? What do I need to be successful? Why am I doing these sort of things, right? And I think, because I think that's often our superpower, is our ability to
Mm,
question, to say why, to be able to find the
yeah.
problem, to be able to do that. But it's also our undoing, because there's never an end, right? Like, even this is why I can't go on like vacations where you lay on a beach, because I sit there and try to workshop it, like relaxing, right? Because I'm like, could I optimize this? Could I move this a little bit better? Could these chairs be arranged a little bit differently? Like, could I be doing something? Because it's just your brain, just, again, it's your superpower. But I think you need to recognize, how do you put that in neutral?
I almost feel like if we had a true shift of paradigm in the way that we approach education, and put people or humans at the center of that, and ask, like, what are the things that we need to learn in the world? These are core foundational things that should be established at the beginning, like the very beginning. Like, what's important to me? What do I like? And check in with yourself on a regular basis. to establish
Right.
these things, because some people don't even consider doing that until it's too late.
Well, no, and I think that's often the problem, right? Is that it only is born out of crisis where I've gotten to a breaking point or something. And that's why I said before about why I know that everybody is creative, right? Because if you walk into any kindergarten class, everybody's a singer, a painter, a superhero, right? Like they're just these open channels, and that society, education, our employers, like creatives are basically the kids that survived, right? Like we're the ones that said,
Mm,
no, I think I can draw for a living. Um, I think we often aren't equipped to understand the state of insecurity and imposter syndrome that comes with that creation. But again, I think when you look at a lot of the most successful companies or the companies that everybody wants to be like, a lot of those things are exhibited in their cultures around either the celebration of creativity, the empowerment of people to be able to make decisions. Like, I mean, there's a lot of those sort of things. Like, I mean, everybody's always like, "Oh, I want to be more innovative." Do you? Because like again, you look at a culture like Spotify. Any team at Spotify is authorized to run a test on up to 1 million of their consumers without talking to anybody.
wow.
Right? Up to 1 million, like that. That's something where it's like, you know what? And then it's like, wow, gee, wonder why they keep coming up with like all these differentiated ideas, or the leader in that space.
Mhm.
So again, I think that, and that's why I said, I think a lot of that creativity, mental health, and corporate culture are in such opposition to each other, and we're sort of at an inflection moment where it's sort of like I think the corporations feel like it's a down economy, so they can put pressure on it. A lot of the employees are
Ooh.
just saying, because again, I've never seen a time where I've seen so many people who are quitting to nothing rather than, even in a time of economic uncertainty, rather than to
Yeah.
continue to exist in that environment.
Yeah.
And anytime you look at this sort of upheaval, right, like the status quo doesn't hold. So I think that we're going to start to see that. But I definitely agree that arming people with more of those sort of skills, because I think that's the most concerning thing to me is when you look at the data, this generation of kids is the first generation, really, and as long as they've been measuring creativity, where you're seeing a decline in creativity in kids.
Interesting. What do you
And I
think
think a lot of
that's?
that is because of the result of helicopter parenting and like, again, not to date myself, but like if I wanted to go, my parents would tell me to go play in the yard. And if you wanted to take your Star Wars figures or your G.I. Joe figures, you had to go make up a story or whatever it is, right? We
Yeah.
didn't have, the TV show and a screen everywhere we went and the video game to be able to do it. And I think a lot of technology has taught us to use technology as for consumption, not for creation.
Mm,
And so I do think that there is a lot of creativity that is at risk because we become such the doom scrolling, social media consuming culture that again we now have an attention span that's shorter than a goldfish, right? Like a lot of the numbers are not moving in the right direction.
and outside of just conversations like these, and um, going back to actually driving change in this regard, for instance, I've been in the enterprise environment as of you, and being in these environments finally got me to the point where I told myself I want to create a space where this just isn't true for people. Now that we have like a negative baseline, some shadow work that we've done through our career, I want to
Yeah.
create a space that cultivates the opposite of this, where people do feel alive. They are in touch with what they love to do, and they're enabled to do that every single day. And I was inspired through the negative experiences that I went to kind of create that. Um, Outside of just like the satellite learning from experiences, how do we get that message out to the world and make that normal and okay? Not only to talk about these things, but to
Yeah.
create spaces where you don't have to go out and do it yourself. You can create that space within your own community, within your own job and workplace.
Yeah. And look, and I think a lot of it for me has always been because I think for so many people that want to do something inside of their company, the question is always like, where do we start? I
Mhm.
think for so many other people, right, like there's always that challenge of just saying like, okay, where does it start? How do we do it? And I think a lot of it for me has always really come down to, I think in whatever way you can inside of your company, going out on your own, doing whatever it is,
Mhm.
for me, it really is, it is modeling the behavior you want, not criticizing the behavior you don't. And I think so many of us gets caught up in just really focusing on and sort of fetishizing what's wrong,
Mm,
as opposed to just simply saying, okay, look, this is what I want to do. This is what the actions are going to be. This is the way I'm going to be able to do this, to find a pocket of people inside my company who believe like I do, to be able to start to work on this stuff, to go find a way to be able to do it, or to do whatever those things are, or to decide that our values aren't aligned and I need to go work someplace else, or whatever those sort of things are. But I think it's just really that understanding and giving yourself permission to be happy almost.
Yeah. And that's one thing that I found a lot of power in, was using complaints or negative feelings as triggers to then flip it and ask myself, well, what am I going to do about it? Or what can I do about it? And being more solution minded as opposed to being problem focused.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of it for me, like I've always sort of almost used it like fuel. Because I think that there's a way where you can look at the problems and you look at what that is and you can feel like it's overwhelming, or you can feel like it's something where it's just like, I can't do anything about it, or, things are never going to change, or like whatever it is. And you can just sort of let that wave wash over you and feel very defeated by it. Which I think there are times where that is an understandable reaction, and like give yourself a moment to be able to do that. But, right. And I think that, a lot of cases, like I've even sort of joked in the past, like coming in as a new leader into an organization, like you almost have to have something wrong in your head, because it's like, no, I know the last 4 leaders haven't been successful. No, I know the product's a mess. No, I know we're not going in the right direction. But this time, because of me, it's going to be different, right? Like there's some mix of just ego and dysfunction that has to go into that sort of approach, right? But I think that that's a lot of what it is, because I think that that's the thing that I've definitely discovered, is that in a lot of ways, being the one that is the example, right? Being the one that will try that thing, being the one that brings other people in, being the one that opens up the conversation or admits whatever that is, or creates the safe space, or does those sort of things, that it's a little bit like that moment in Braveheart where like as soon as the one guy runs over the hill, then people just start streaming over after them.
Yeah.
Because I think, again, that's the thing, is that we talked about before around where there's a misalignment between creativity and corporate culture and what they reward. Again, taking those sort of risks, being that sort of leader, looking at innovation, doing these sort of things, these are often not things that are rewarded inside of corporate culture. And so again, that ability to try to normalize these things, that ability to create space for these things, to create space for those conversations, for doing those sort of things, and to just showing people that it is possible, that it's possible in a constructive way, that it isn't coming in and rage quitting, right? And going, screw this place, right? Like that you can start to be able to do that. Because again, I think that, and it's also the understanding that just look, for a lot of people that have been in it for a while, it's hard enough, but just in general, like hope is more work, right? We are physiologically wired to think that negative news is more important than positive news. Right. So again, like there's a natural disposition for a lot of us to want to go towards the negative, to want to gossip, to be able to do those sort of things, as opposed to seeing the opportunity to be able to do those sort of things. So I think it's also understanding that is what it is you're going to be up against. And if you think you're going to stand up like Rudy or, whatever, and like all of a sudden everybody's going to like hoist you up on your shoulders, yeah, you're going to get there, but you're going to have to go through a pretty long point of it not working, whatever. And then till finally it breaks through.
Resilience can get you a very far way. But it's something else that you were speaking to when you were talking about your career, or more so being career focused and focusing on goals and working toward that. You kind of get that dopamine hit along the way, and then when you achieve that thing, the dopamine subsided. And I think it was Andrew Huberman that had a conversation around this, where the way that it actually works in your mind is the dopamine release is in anticipation of the thing, not necessarily in the attainment of it. So it's almost like, how do you shift that so that you enjoy the journey, the gaps in between those goals, and find joy in what you're doing when, like you're saying, maybe a whole lot of it is just masochistic.
Well, I mean, and look, and I think this has been a part of my mental health journey, is really sort of understanding and how do I tease apart happiness and joy. Because I think that a lot of what I realized is, happiness in the concept as most people understand it tends to be a target-based emotional state, right? If I do this, if I get this job, if I buy this thing, and like you said, it's either in the anticipation lead up to it or the moment of accomplishment, that whenever you get that, then I will be happy. The problem with target-based emotional validation is that whenever you achieve it, you get the job, you buy the thing, you do the thing, whatever it is. The problem is, yes, you get that endorphin and that dopamine hit whenever it happens, but it tends to be very short-lived, right? So you'll
Yeah.
sort of go along and you get a spike whenever you do that. Well, shortly after that, your brain goes, cool, we did it. Let's throw the next target out there. So then you crash back down because now we are in pursuit of the next thing.
Yeah.
So this sort of emotionally spiky relationship to me was very, very difficult because there were just sort of fleeting moments of happiness and a lot of inadequacy. And so I think a lot of it for me was really the focus on, yes, I want those targets to be there, but I think I need to focus in equal measure on the joy of what do I look forward to every day, right? Like, how do I show up? Who do
Mm.
I want to work with? What do I want to do it with? How do I enjoy really the day in and day out, the process, the craftsmanship, what goes into doing what I do? And honestly, even just allowing myself to be happy, to reflect on that, to be able to take a moment of
Yeah.
enjoying my achievement and not. And so I think even a lot of my goal setting now has become equal parts of what do I want to accomplish, but also what have I accomplished? Because I think so
Mm.
much of it for me was just the perception was always in the deficit of what it wasn't.
Oh, interesting.
And so I think a lot of it for me was recognizing that that was taking a toll on me, that constant feeling of inadequacy, of it never being enough. And again, when you talk to other people, it's like, oh my God, you've accomplished so much. And it's like, I just see the mistakes. And right. And so being able to be a little kinder to myself, or to be able to, because I think that's often the real challenge for us is, the what goes into imposter syndrome and what goes into a lot of those sort of things. These are aspects of insecurity and drive and knowledge and evolution, right? Like, these are things that will make you great if they are kept in balance.
Mm.
Right. So, like, my goal is never to get rid of my imposter syndrome or to get rid of my insecurity. It's to keep it in a healthy balance, because I know that if I'm able to harness those things, they will continue to make me extremely successful because they continue to propel me forward. It's whenever they get out of balance and out of control, where either if I minimize them too much, then I get too comfortable, I stop, evolving, and I lose some of my relevancy. Or if they become overblown, then I get sort of paralyzing imposter syndrome. And then the problem is you become afraid of putting out new ideas or taking
Yeah.
risks, right? So it's sort of splitting the difference on that of how do I keep myself in that state of being comfortable, being uncomfortable, without falling into the complacency side of just doing the same thing over and over again because it's worked in the past, but also the not being paralyzed by problems and those sort of things, right? So I
Yeah.
think striking that balance and being able to figure that out, I think that's usually more of the trick around some of that.
100%. And I guess another way to call it out, it's almost like you have to very not almost like you have to. You in order to do that, you have to create the safe space that we were talking about earlier with others within
Hmm.
yourself for those emotions to exist and take place and be okay.
Well, and I think that's what a lot of what I often will ask people to do is I think you need to find a balance between an internal and external perspective. Because I think, for a lot of us, like, I will recognize that I will always be my own biggest blind spot, right? Just because how I perceive myself and how I think things are not necessarily reality. I mean, again, it's like doing this show, right? I'm sure whenever I listen back to my voice, like, I've heard my voice in my head every day for my entire life, and you hear it back and you're like, I don't sound like that. Yeah, you do. Right. And so I think
Yeah.
you need the internal perspective. You need sort of what it is that you think you want to accomplish. But I think you do need to balance that with feedback, with getting, other people's perspectives, with understanding
Mm.
the positive and the negatives of sort of how you affect people to sort of help balance out some of those blind spots, because there are places where you don't give yourself enough credit. Maybe there are places where you give yourself too much credit.
Mm.
But I think that sort of work on that self-awareness, right? I think that's often one of the defining characteristics of the most successful people I know,
Mm.
is that there is an ongoing work and investment in that self-awareness
Yes.
of either what do I do when I have a really good idea? What do I do whenever I'm creatively really flat? What do I do
Mm.
when I am a good leader? What do I do whenever people really disconnect from me? Because again, and I think that there's that sort of active investment, because again, I think the people that struggle the most are the ones that kind of go like emotionally tone deaf,
Mm.
where they either aren't seeking that sort of feedback because they're very comforted in their own perspective.
Mm.
Again, this often leads to the search to be right. But again, I think that ability to be able to sort of balance those perspectives, because I know in
Yeah.
my career, I've made a lot of moves that haven't made sense to other people. That's fine. And again, that's the place where I'm going to lean on the internal voice more.
Yeah.
There are times whenever, like, things haven't been going as well, where I need that feedback and I need to see that maybe I do have a blind spot there and something I need to work on. So again, I think that it's there are a lot of tricks and tools you can do to be able to do that. But I think doing those sort of things, um, and just staying open to the process, that who I am today in 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years is going to be different. My insecurities and my strengths are going to be different. That it's not a it's not a process that's ever going to be done. And that if I accept that and accept the flaws and accept that this is going to need to be ongoing work,
Mm-hmm.
then usually my ability to continue to stay in touch, stay relevant, stay successful often goes along with that work.
Mm. And what about the instances where like you're unaware that you're unaware?
Well, but look, I think that's, look, I think that's why in a lot of cases for me, like, whether it's getting that group of people you can surround yourself, whether it's getting a
Yeah.
personal board of directors, whether it's, because look, I mean, I think for a lot of us, we need somebody who is the cheerleader, who will come in, who will point out what's really good for you. I think you need somebody who's the
Yep.
motivator, who's going to keep you going. And I think you need somebody that is the unvarnished truth teller, right? And will hold you accountable to what that is, because I think also in your personal development, that's often one of the challenges for people. It is incredibly easy for me to rationalize and to let myself
Oh yeah.
down for why I'm not going to do something. It's incredibly hard to let other people down. So
Mm.
again, I think this is where you need those advisors, those truth tellers, somebody that you can talk to. You need to be able to sort of do that stuff, because I think, again, you don't want to build that sort of echo chamber just for yourself. And so again, I think, but again, that can be uncomfortable. And here again, I think that again, the
Come full
ability, and I think
circle.
that's a place where I just embrace and love, because I've gotten myself to a place where if I am not uncomfortable, I know I'm not doing things right.
Mm.
Right? Because either I'm not growing, my work isn't growing, I'm not pushing myself forward. If it's sort of like, if it starts to feel a little bit too comfortable, I'm like, I need to go burn some stuff down.
Mm. I love that. Stephen, I know we're coming up on time. This has been a fantastic conversation as always. Thank you so much. Are there any parting words or insights that you would like to leave in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only one is, and I think this has been, it's advice that was given to me recently, because I think as I've been on my own journey of stepping away from the corporate world, of starting my own design studio, of doing a lot of these things, which honestly I was very hesitant about, because I think I was in a place where I could only see what I could lose, not what I could gain.
Mm.
And I think one of the people who was on my personal board of directors kind of sat down and gave me the advice that I give to a lot of other people, which is, she had said, look, Stephen, you need to remember that like the success that you want, the fulfillment that you want sits on the other side of the discomfort you don't want to go through. Right. And I think for so many of us, right, like discomfort is the cost of fulfillment and happiness. That for so many of
Mm.
us, the outcomes we want is often on the other side of the work we don't want to do. And I think especially as you get a little bit further along in your career and those sort of things, right? Like this is again it just tends to be what's left. And so I think,
Interesting.
that's a lot of it for me, is that, discomfort is the cost of fulfillment. And I think that for so many of us, it's a really good reminder to be able to have. It's a really good, again, piece of advice I give for a lot of people, because I think, confidence comes out of those jumps, not from doing the same thing over and over again. That I think the way to fight off imposter syndrome is to be able to take those risks in whatever way you want to be able to do that.
Mm.
But again, I think that's a lot of it for me, is I try to keep myself in that state of discomfort now.
Mm.
But I think,
Yep.
again, for a lot of us to really sort of look at that and make sure that you are continuing to challenge yourself, because I think that is the biggest piece of advice I can give people, is there is such a difference between moving through this industry, getting what you want, versus taking what you're given. And for too many of us, we just take the next step because it's what's available, right? We just take the next step because it's what the next part of our company is. And I think so often we give up on what we want, or sort of what it is that we think we want, or that again, we get to that place of showing up as who everybody else wants us to be, not as who we are. And I think, there's so many creatives I talk to who are later on in their 40s, 50s, 60s of their career, who just say, look, Steve, I don't love this anymore and I don't know why.
Mm.
You can almost always trace it back to that. And so I think having that vision and willing to, make yourself uncomfortable, that is going to be, no matter what technology does, no matter what the industry does, right? Like those are the things that are always going to keep you in that place to be happy and successful.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. So how can people connect? Is there anything that people should be on the lookout for in the near term future with what you're working on?
Oh, Yeah, I mean, we got a ton of work that's going on. So I think if you want to hear more about this stuff, I've got about 7.5 years and about 130 episodes on the Crazy One. So just search the Crazy One on your favorite podcast platform, or you can go to thecrazyone.com, which is the words the crazy and the number one.com. Yeah, I mean, Crazy, which is spelled CRZY, is my design studio. And if you want to find out more about my work, just go to my name, stephengates.com. And that also every single week on the Amazing Design People list, I give 3 free half-hour mentoring sessions. They tend to book up pretty quick, so you might have to keep an eye on that. But yeah, if anybody wants to talk more, that's always a platform where you can find me, and feel free to talk and get some advice.
And that's adplist.org, and we'll have all of the links that he mentioned down below. Thank you again, Stephen. Always a pleasure. Looking forward to talking to you again when it's not recorded. But thank you so much for sharing and imparting your wisdom with the audience out here.
Sure. Andrew, thanks so much for having me. We'll talk soon.
Talk soon. Thank you.